Get ready to be inspired by the great things happening in rural education. The Rural Scoop will bring you new ideas and innovative solutions. We'll dive into education issues and we'll highlight what's working in your rural communities. You will hear from a variety of educators, administrators, professionals, and others who will provide relevant and engaging content in each episode. And now, serving up the scoop, here's your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf.
I am really looking forward to a conversation that I'm going to have today with an esteemed researcher in the world of rural education, and that's 𝐂𝐨𝐲𝐲𝐫𝐢𝐠𝐡𝐭. She is an associate professor of education at Bates College. She is an author of a book that we're going to be talking about, Why Rural Schools Matter. And she's done some amazing work around school closures and consolidations in rural communities. And so I'm very excited to welcome 𝐂𝐨𝐲𝐲𝐲𝐫𝐢𝐠𝐡𝐭 to the Rural Scoop and get a chance to dive into all of the good content that I know that she's going to be able to share with us today. So Mara, welcome.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you having me here.
Well, before we get started, can you give us an introduction of who you are and where you come from and how you ended up where you are now?
Yes. So as you mentioned, I'm an associate professor of education at Bates College, which is located in Lewiston, Maine. And before I was here and before graduate school, I was a third grade teacher in rural Tennessee. So I started my teaching career in rural Tennessee in the small town of Van Lear. And that is... Well, and actually, even before that, I went to a college that's actually located in a pretty rural place, and I got trained. I got my teaching certification while there, and I was really struck during college, even by how we're in this rural place, and I was doing my student teaching in rural Vermont. Yet the only thing we were talking about in my college classes were urban classrooms. And so I was really kind of fascinated by this disconnect. And I love my student teaching. And that's really what propelled me, into education and to make this my life's work. But this sort of disconnect between how important the rural schools seem to be to that rural community, yet nobody was talking about it in terms of policy making or research. So I after college, I graduated, I got this job teaching in rural Tennessee. And similarly there, I loved it. The school was this critical resource for the community. It's the kind of place where, everything was centered around the community. The Christmas concert, the town meeting. It's, the place where, kids, of course, saw one another, but parents saw one another too, and grandparents and cousins. And if there was a school supper and people would come out of the woodwork, for the supper. And so I was just, I still just continue to be so amazed by how critical and important these schools were. Yet nobody, at least nobody in the policymaking arena or the research arena was really talking about it. And so after a few years teaching there, I made the really hard decision to, because I love teaching and I loved my students, but I made the really hard decision to go back to graduate school and get my doctorate and try to do something about that gap. And I didn't really know what that meant at the outset. I was pretty sure I wanted to go into policymaking, but I had no idea what that really was. And then I ended up falling in love with research, and a very particular kind of research, like really being able to having the gift of someone's story. So being able to sit down and talk to somebody and hear how important their school was and why it was important, or what it meant when their school closed, or maybe even the history of racism and classism that might lead to a closure. That always, it just felt like such a privilege to hear these stories. And so I ended up, I loved that part of doing research. And so that ended up kind of pushing me into academia. And so now, I continue to get to teach, mostly urban kids now. And that's something actually that I look at in part of my research, why we don't see more rural students in four-year schools or four-year colleges. So I continue to teach and then also continue to do research around rural education, the critical importance of rural schools, how rural schools sometimes perpetuate racial or class inequities, but how they can also be a really important driver for repairing these kinds of racial and class inequities. And then also as a part of that, looking at school consolidation and school closure.
Right. So let's shift to that then, Mara. There are a lot of reasons that schools might close or consolidate, but as you've done your research and had a chance to talk to people around the country, first of all, why are they closing?
Yeah.
What are the justifications around those closures? And then what kinds of processes do people that are in that school system typically need to go through in order to lead that closure in a rural community?
Yeah, those are all really good questions. So the why is kind of constantly evolving. It usually comes down to enrollment and budget, sometimes academics. But the constant is that they are closing. And so the particular threat or how it manifests in a particular state, because these are usually governed by state policies, the particular threat might change. But kind of the overall trend is that rural schools have been closing. Honestly, for hundreds of years. And so, what it is that's pushing the closure, varies. And certainly during like the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, desegregation led to the mass closure of Black schools. So it's really important to kind of have that particular context as well. These closures have always been disproportionately felt in terms of race and in terms of class. But so some states have consolidation laws, which mandate the consolidation of school districts, which typically then leads to school closure. And these consolidation laws might be like, enrollment thresholds. So if in Arkansas for a long time, they had a policy called Act 60, which mandated that if a district fell below 350 students for 2 years in a row, it would be consolidated. And other states might have consolidation policies related to facilities. So if you build a new facility, it needs to be, this, so big. And then the only way to justify that is by having a consolidated district. So there are certain state policies that lead to it. There are also policies related to academics. So closure can be a quote unquote fix if a district is deemed failing for a number of years. And, again, like the language around that has changed. It differs from state to state. But school closure is sometimes turned to for academic reasons. And then, of course, districts can decide to close schools themselves.
Sure.
And that's usually driven by budgets or lower, enrollment dropping. And so the justification tends to be, this idea that closing schools is more efficient, or that it leads to improved academics, or that it's somehow more equitable. Like, the reasoning goes, or the argument goes, these kids in this small rural school, they can't have the kind of academic programs that they could in a larger school, so we're going to close the school. Those are there's a lot of assumptions in all of that. And what we find is that the research often doesn't bear out or doesn't support those assumptions. But those are the justifications that are often given.
So what is the research findings around whether closing schools or not really does have an academic benefit or an academic impact on student outcomes?
Yeah, so the research is a little mixed here. So what we find is that in the short term, there does seem to be a drop. And I'm going to qualify all of this by these are test score data.
Sure.
Okay, and so it's problematic in all kinds of ways, but that tends to be the way that we measure academic impacts. So what we tend to see is a drop in test scores in the short term. And there's even some research that suggests that there might be a drop in test scores even preceding the closure. And then sort of, in the couple of years after. Test scores seem to recover after some period of time, maybe a year. There's some research, recent research coming out that suggests maybe 3 years. I mean, one important thing to recognize, though, is that it really depends on the quality of the receiving school as to what this means for the students. And so some of the research, and this is not specific to rural schools, but it looks at school closures overall. Some of the research on closures that were really tied to No Child Left Behind, they suggested that oftentimes students that were in schools that were being closed for academic reasons or academic failure, ironically, were not sent to a better school. And so, of course, their test scores did not improve. And as I mentioned, there actually is some newer research coming out right now that suggests that there's even a long-term effect on, and this is research that was done on school closures in Texas. There's a longer-term effect on post-secondary enrollment and even employment in the years after closure, and so negative impacts on that. So despite the kind of academic rationale, what we're finding is that oftentimes it does not lead to a boost in test scores. And this really, it varies a lot from, particular situation to particular situation. So I don't know if you can make like blanket statements, but overall, the evidence is not super promising. The other big thing to recognize is that, this is more kind of in the realm of extracurriculars. So when we look at rural closures, yes, oftentimes rural students who experience a school closure and are sent to a larger school, they might have access to more extracurricular activities. What's less clear is if they're actually able to take advantage of those extracurriculars because they're farther away from the school. And so, yes, they've got a football team now, but they can't actually be on the football team because, they don't have a parent that can pick them up from practice. Some districts are pretty good about running buses late at night. But I was working with a district down in Arkansas that for a number of years, they had kids that were on the bus for 4 hours a day. And so, I think we can all agree that that's kind of an inhumane amount of time. Right. And then, 4 hours, 2 hours in the morning, get to school, then you're there for, band practice or football practice or whatever, then you got another 2 hours. You're not getting home till 9, 10 o'clock at night. And so the kind of developmental impacts of that, the social impacts, what that means for, your family relationships, or even family members being able to be involved in all those things. The parents can't get to the football game because it is 2 hours away. We need some better research that really looks at this argument around extracurricular participation and availability of more opportunities. It's not clear whether or not rural students, particularly those in the remotest districts, would really be able to even take advantage of those opportunities if they exist.
So, Mara, how would you quantify the impact of the closure on the broader community then? Because you're talking about parent engagement, community engagement in this newly consolidated school that potentially is not as rich as it was before the school closure took place.
Yeah.
And so can you talk a little bit about that? And then maybe also some of the research around the economic impacts that school closures have on the community at large, whether they're employment or local business.
Right. And so, and this is what my work focuses on the most, is looking at what are the community impacts of school closure. And so I guess I'll start with the second question, which is the economic impact. The first thing I'll say is I'm a qualitative researcher. So, I'm not number crunching here, but I can look at like the trends. And it's hard to isolate the impact of a closure in particular, because many closures, particularly in rural communities, are happening in places that are experiencing population decline. Mm-hmm. So what we usually see is there is a drop in the number of businesses, for example, before the closure and then after the closure. But as I start to look at some of the numbers, what I do see is that if you're looking at similar places, those that have schools versus those that don't, they're experiencing larger declines in the number of businesses that are leaving, that kind of thing. And this is because schools support not just So first, there's the economic impact of teachers losing their jobs, and that doesn't always, there's not always a net loss in jobs, but kind of who's in those positions can really shift after a closure. So there's the losses that come with the school closure, directly for school employees. But then there's all the ancillary businesses that schools support. So this might be the local diner, the local bank that the school would do business with, the service station where the buses were serviced, the gas station where they would buy gas. All of those businesses no longer have that source of revenue. And so what I hear from community members is, economically, it devastated our community. And the grocery store closed, the little diner closed. We used to have 3 gas stations. Now we have 1. And so there does seem to be this economic impact on communities. Again, many of them were experiencing economic decline before that, but it seems to speed up because of a school closure. And then I think the really important part to also understand is that it's hard to attract new businesses when you don't have a school. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just that there's this decline, there's also this sort of feeling of hopelessness around what this means for our future and our ability to grow, in the coming years, because we can't get new business here because we don't have a school. And there's also been some really good research. Thomas Lyson did some, I think it's Thomas, Lyson did some work a number of years ago, and then Sipple did some work in years since that compare similarly sized towns, those with schools versus those without. And what they find is that there tends to be more, housing values are lower in communities that don't have schools. There's more economic inequality. And so, broadly, the economic impact of a school closure is quite devastating. And then there's kind of all the other school roles that schools play in communities. It tends to be a place where people come together, and so families, they see one another at the Friday night football game. They go out to eat together at the diner afterwards. It's when one of the schools I would work at, there was always community members coming in and they're like, I need to fax this right now. And, and the women in the front office will let them fax it right there in the front office. And so there's this kind of loss of a social center that really happens with the closure of a school. I also hear a lot about how in small rural places, raising children is a communal responsibility. It is not just the responsibility of the parents, but it's the extended family, and it's the teachers, and it's, the aunties and uncles and everybody. And you can't do that in the same way when you don't have a school. Just because you can't be as tapped in, you can't know exactly what's happening in the building. You can't, your teacher might also be your aunt, or it might be your friend's aunt. There's not that same kind of, you can't raise kids in the same way when you don't have a school right there in the community. I heard all these lovely stories about, it would be common to so a kid messes up at school, does something really off the wall. And the teacher calls the parents. The kid comes home from school, and guess who's sitting right there at the kitchen table? The parents and the teacher. You can't do that when you don't have a school, right? And so there's that kind of communal raising of children that gets compromised when you don't have a school. There's also loss of leadership positions. So in this, especially what happens with consolidation. So when you have a district, you have a school board. That's an elected position. So when a school district is consolidated, those school board positions evaporate. And so there's less opportunities for public service and to build leaders. And this, I think, it has a really important racial impact. So, I've done a lot of work in the rural South, and Jimerson did some research showing that in Arkansas, when districts were consolidated, there was a disproportionate impact. There was more of an impact on Black communities. And it was Black school board members and Black superintendents that really lost their jobs, disproportionate to what we would see among white community members. And this was especially important in a place where, land might still be owned by, white landowners. Banks are still run by white people. And so the schools and political office related to the schools is a really important source of Black leadership. And when districts are eliminated and schools are closed, that also goes. So there's also this, impact on leadership positions as well. And then the final thing I'll just say too is that I've talked a little bit about the racial disproportionality. There's also this disproportionately impacts low-income families because families that don't have transportation. So something as simple as it's noon, it's the middle of the school day, and your kid throws up at school. The parents got to go pick that kid up. Well, if you don't have access to a car and you don't have a school in your community, how are you going to get there? And so, that impacts that child, that impacts that family, that impacts also the narrative that school officials might be telling about that family. Oh, those parents are just uninvolved. They just don't care. So there's this really has a kind of classist impact as well.
You just recently launched a website, which I'm really excited to have you talk about. And it has a lot of this background information on it, but it also talks about strategies for potentially fighting against a school closure.
Yep.
And it then, if that has to happen, how do you close well? So can you talk a little bit about making sure that closures are done equitably, as you noted, but if there's a way to prevent them from even moving forward in that discussion of a school closure, how can a community come together and potentially leverage some community support around fighting it?
Yeah. So I recently, I don't know what the word is, started. I recently created a website. It's called ruralschoolsopen.org. And it's meant to be a web-based resource for communities that are threatened with closure. And what it has is information there that to help kind of research background on what is closure, why do schools close, a lot of the things that we've talked about right here. And then it has resources on how to fight closure. And then it also has resources for, okay, if closure is a foregone conclusion, how do you close well and try to do that in an equitable way. And so I'd encourage listeners to go there and see it's got a whole bunch of drop-down menus with all kinds of different strategies. And these strategies I developed through talking with organizers, policymakers, and district leaders. And actually, you and I first met when I was interviewing you to get some background on this. And so all of these strategies, they've been tested out. They've been workshopped, and they come from kind of lessons learned in the field. And so there's a whole bunch there. And I also link to other websites and other resources, but it has strategies around, okay, well, how could we think about cutting costs or increasing our revenue? What might be some strategies that we might engage in to boost enrollment? How could we think about improving our academic quality and also improving the awareness of our academic quality in ways that might help prevent closure. And I think that kind of the two biggest things I will say here is if you're going to try to fight closure, you got to start early. So the biggest thing I hear from communities is that we didn't realize that it was really going to happen. We took action when it was too late. And so you do not want to wait until closure is kind of imminent and really something that's being thought about in the next year or two. You want to start strategizing when you're 5 or 10 years out. So when closure is even just kind of a distant possibility, that's the time to start organizing. And that's the second thing I would mention is that organizing is really important. So this means you got to develop relationships, you got to build your base, you got to have good leadership, you got to hold people accountable. You got to have an organization that can really, do work on this. And then this website can provide a lot of the more specific strategies that you might use, the things you might do. How do you think about changing policy? How do you change a board member's a board member's perspective. If you don't like your board members, how do you think about electing, community members that are responsive to the board? And then the sort of, the other part of this is, then there are communities where closure is happening. And so how do you think about closing in a way that minimizes the impact on the community, minimizes the negative impact on the community or on the children, and kind of maximizes the potential for there to be academic growth, and for the community to emerge, stronger out of it. And there's, a list of questions here for community members to be asking leadership. How are my children going to get to school? Is transportation going to cover after school activities? How will the public be informed about the process of closure? Those kinds of things. And then really thinking about how do you actually prepare the students? So how do you integrate these two student bodies together to create something that's new rather than just adding, I think oftentimes the perspective of leaders can be, okay, so we have this school and now we're just adding a few extra kids. You've really got to think about this in a much more holistic way. Like you are merging two schools together to create something new and something better. And how do you do that? So those are some of the tips there. And then there's a big resource page that has a whole bunch of other resources around not just closure, but also how do you have strong rural schools that I hope your listeners might find useful.
How important is it that the closure have community input into that decision-making process? And have you, in the opportunities you've had to talk with others that have gone through this, found that there are ways to do it well, to have community organization around this well, and then things that just didn't work?
Yeah. And I think your first point here is like the most important. You've got to have community input. And so the leadership needs to be out in the community, and not just inviting parents into the school building, but actually going to the churches, the mosques, all of the sites where community members gather, and talking to them. I think community members need to feel like this process is fair and it's transparent. So they know what's going to happen. They know what to expect. And they know that there are going to be costs and it is going to be a burden and it's not disproportionate on any one particular community. Related to that, I think making sure that the communication is not just with a few select community members, but really gets into all communities that exist in that rural place. So thinking about, how are you, speaking to the concerns of, parents that live over in this particular area of the community? Have we thought about the transportation concerns that parents that don't have transportation are going to have? So making sure the communication is consistent, strong, that it is, it reaches out to everybody, and it really does get genuine input. And by genuine input, and this is, I think, what I hear the most, is that it can't be performative. It can't be something that like, oh, we're just checking the box to, we needed to publicize this, so we're publicizing it. It actually needs to be something that the plan changes because of what people said. So the plan should not be predetermined. It should be something that is evolving in response to community feedback. And community members can see how it's evolving. And then I think the other big thing is, this is a big transition for our children. Mm-hmm. So you've really got to think about how do you invite kids into the school building, let them tour around the new facility. If there's a bus ride involved, can the parents go on the bus ride for that first time? Can you have community picnics that bring the two communities together before the new school year? So I think, having clear communication, consistent communication that is really, really thorough across all areas of, the community, all pockets of the community. And then that really involves the students, I think is really, really important.
The physical buildings of the closed schools are often left to mothball, but they're also more and more we're seeing that rural communities are repurposing them for the community's benefit. Can you talk a little bit about that being present in the conversations you've had with leaders?
Yeah, I mean, first, I cannot overstate the importance of this. So when you have an empty school building in a community, people talk, and it's not being used, people talk about it as an eyesore. They talk about it as it reminds them that they've lost their school. And there can really be a sense of hopelessness attached to that. So reclaiming those buildings and using those buildings is really, really important. And so figuring out what's going to happen to the buildings in the negotiations, like especially if this is a part of a consolidation, is really important. And making sure that, so, state law varies from state to state. So you'd really want to get into like understand what the municipal law is to sort of see who has control over the buildings, how does control transfer, all of those kinds of things. But I think making sure that it goes to an organization that is really a community organization is important. I heard a number of stories in the Delta where buildings would go to, this would be a predominantly Black community. The children and the families that were affected by the closure were Black, yet the building goes to like a white church or to a white farmer. And I've heard some awful stories about farmers, keeping their cattle in the school building. And so this historic site is ruined. And so you've got to be really careful about kind of who gets the building. And then that it goes to a community purpose. And I've heard some really interesting things that can happen to buildings. So they're a site for preschools or daycare centers. They can house museums. They can house a library. They can be a place where they often hold after-school programs. And that can be a really important thing, particularly given what we talked about with like the challenges around transportation for extracurriculars or after-school programming. They can be a place where GED classes are offered for local adults, computer classes, workforce development, all of those things. But, it costs money to upkeep a building. And then it costs even more money if the building has fallen into disrepair in the meantime. So really getting control of that building quickly, having a plan for how you're going to have the funds to continue to operate the building, making sure that it's, heat, water, electricity, those things are provided for. And then, then I think the question is, like, how does the community use this facility in a way, or use this moment in a way to think about how the facility might play into long-term plans for the community? So, if there's a local factory that opened up, maybe the school becomes the perfect site to offer the kind of workforce training that would allow local community members to be ready to be employed by that factory. So then how do you develop the partnerships that would allow for that? But like attaching the use of the building to some sort of vision for the community in the future is really critical to make sure all of it aligns and that the school really can become an institution for the community and can play a part in that revitalization that might need to happen. And I was just down in Arkansas talking to some local community members. And I work with a great organization down there called Rural Community Alliance, and they've been fighting against school closures in Arkansas for years. And I was just talking to some folks down there, and I asked them this question. I said, you often hear that when a rural school is closed, it quote unquote kills the community. How do you feel about that? Is that true? And I got some, mixed answers, but the answer I got most frequently was no, it does not kill the community. It kills our employment, but it actually, it's an opportunity for us to do that kind of visioning. It's an opportunity for us to come together as a community, realize what's really important, to develop relationships, to use this building in a way that will facilitate us, kind of move us in the direction of creating a stronger community in the future. And then also just for the organizing work that went into trying to prevent the closure, we usually build leadership. So, I've come to think about school closure as, I know this is going to sound like overstating it, but I really don't think it is, as kind of an attempted murder. And it particularly like forced closures that are discriminatory. It can be an attempted murder, where it really can devastate the local economy. It can really hit relationships. It can test relationships, but it doesn't actually have to kill the community. And sometimes we see communities emerging even stronger from it. So I don't want to like discount the importance of or the magnitude of what happens when schools are closed, but I do not think that it needs to spell the end of a particular rural community.
How can communities document what they're going through and then communicate that out so that those that might be considering school closure in the future might have some of that local anecdotal information that could help inform their own efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll be completely honest with you. I don't think there's a great, like, I mean, I think local organizations are doing amazing work around this. And Rural Community Alliance, who I'm working with right now, they're creating a documentary on Act 60, which was the consolidation law that led to all these closures in the state. And so that kind of local work is absolutely essential. It can be really important for persuading policymakers to shape policy in all kinds of ways. What I would like to see happen is more of a national effort around documentation and speaking to policymakers in a way that, so the fight doesn't have to be one-off all the time. You know, we're not always putting out fires, but there's more of a national movement around this. And I say that for a couple of reasons. Number one, like I don't think there is that kind of national repository of these stories right now. Number two, we know that closure is a national threat. And three, we know that right now, closures are likely to get worse in the coming years. And I'd say this for a few reasons. There are many rural places that are facing dropping enrollments. The pandemic exacerbated this in all sorts of ways. And we know that numbers have not bounced back to pre-pandemic levels. We know that many states are adopting laws related to school choice, privatization that might further drain public school enrollments. And then much of the pandemic funding that's dried up now. And so I unfortunately am anticipating a wave of closures in these next few years. And so I think it's going to be like especially critical to be really building a national movement around this so people can share resources across state lines and really build alliance and really build awareness of this on a national level so that we can organize better. And I would encourage folks to get in touch with me. I would love to be able to somehow on this website house these stories and, continue to build this out in response to what people are doing locally.
And what about the correlations between urban and rural? You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that unfortunately we're seeing closures not just in rural places, but also in urban places. And there's a lot of similarities between urban and rural anyway.
Yep.
What are the things that you're noticing about those types of closures?
No, and I'm really glad you brought this up. This is not just a rural issue. So the particular nature of the threat, again, it might differ from, rural versus urban. But this is also happening in many urban areas. Cities like, over the past 10 years, cities in, like Chicago, New York City, Oakland, they have all faced these mass closures. There's a really compelling book written by Eve Ewing called Ghosts in the Schoolyard around the impact of closures in Chicago. So this is another reason why I think we need to be building these kind of alliances across state lines and across like that urban-rural divide, because this is not something that is just happening to rural communities or just happening to urban communities, which I think is something that maybe the national media somehow seems to forget that what this has been happening in rural communities for centuries. But to really effectively organize. Again, I sort of said at the outset here, fighting school closure is really a matter of organizing our communities. And so there's the kind of organizing you need to do locally. Then there's the kind of organizing you need to do across state lines. Then there's this kind of urban-rural organizing that needs to happen because this is not something that is happening just to rural kids. Where it happens is in places that are spatially marginalized, and places that are under-resourced just by virtue of their zip code. And we know that those places tend to be very, very urban and very, very rural. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned by organizing across that urban-rural divide, and ways to share resources, ways to really think innovatively about, how do you bring attention to this issue? How do you think about the policies that cause closure? How do we get those policies changed? How do we get leadership that really cares about this as an issue?
Well said. And now a word from our sponsor. So I'm going to shift our conversation away from school closure and consolidation to some of the other research that you're working on. And I know that you've done quite a bit around college experiences of rural first generation students. Can you talk a little bit about that research and some of those unique challenges that those students are facing?
Yeah. So, like you said, a large part of my research focuses on rural first-gen students' access and opportunities and experiences in college. I am just finishing up a study, and hopefully I will have a book coming out in this coming spring that looks at the experiences of 9 rural first-generation students, and it follows them from the moment of the summer before they start college to the fall after graduation. And it looks at their experiences at an elite 4-year college. And I did that deliberately. First, we know that rural students are underrepresented at 4-year schools. They're also particularly underrepresented at elite schools. And while some of the challenges related to eliteness, some of the cultural divides and, money and, the wealth divides might be exacerbated in those settings, I think there's still a lot of lessons that we can learn about college access in general, based on the experiences of those that might be likely to experience them most acutely. And what we see is that place shapes all aspects of the college experience. So it shapes everything from where admission officers go, which high schools they go to. They're not going to the rural remote ones. And so rural kids then might not know about the kind of college, they might not know about sort of the full gamut or the full array of college options open to them. And then many private 4-year schools can offer better financial aid than some state schools. And so kind of ironically, the ones that have the highest sticker price might actually be the most affordable for some rural kids. And so what they're doing is they're being effectively shut out of an opportunity. It could be the most financially accessible pathway to get them to school. So there's all kinds of, and I could, go through all the barriers, less AP classes, less guidance counselors, right, in rural schools. Like I said, college admissions officers not reaching out in the same kind of way. We also know that rurality and first generation status are correlated. So, rural students are disproportionately likely to also be first gen. So then there's all the challenges that come with being a first generation student. How do you access college? And the transportation barriers. We also just know that students are more likely to apply to college and go to college when they have a college located close to them. And many rural students live in education deserts, so places that don't have many institutions of higher education. So in all kinds of ways, rural students, and particularly rural first-generation students, are disadvantaged in terms of even accessing a college experience. And then when they get to college, the first thing I'll say is that this group of 9 students that I followed, they did quite well. All of them made it through their 4 years at this elite selective school. They all graduated. They're employed, they have jobs, they're going on to graduate school. So they make it, they do well. But while they're there, they face a lot of barriers. And some of these are barriers around wealth. The students, they all came from working class backgrounds. And so just being able to, pay for the study abroad, or to be able to, afford books. Those things they were likely to face challenges like that. But then they also had challenges that were, related to things like when it came time to get a summertime job. The jobs that were most available to them, and often the ones that were best paying, were back home, manual labor or, working class kind of jobs that actually paid fairly well. But they're not the kind of internships that would set them up well post-graduation. And so they don't have access to kind of the full college experience. And then when it comes time for graduation, what they find is that most of the students either wanted to or expected to move to an urban place. And for some of them, they entered college. That was their sincere desire. For other of those, it was more of an evolving understanding. And we know that most jobs that use a college degree are located in urban places. And especially ones that pay well enough where they can pay back their loans, they've got now coming due. But because they don't have those kind of co-curricular opportunities, the internships and all of that, they're actually not competitive for many of those jobs. And they don't have the networks either that would allow them to access many of those jobs. So they're kind of caught in this bind where they can't go home because there's not the jobs there that would use their degree. But they're having a hard time going anywhere else either. And so the barriers and the challenges continue. I mean, that said, these students are super resourceful. I do believe they're going to, they're going to find those jobs. And, I've been in touch with them since then, and they are. But they are not, they don't, I guess they don't receive everything promised to them in terms of what that college education is supposed to mean. And then, of course, there's the kind of cultural divides that exist now with their family that also make it really difficult to go home. And they're super close to their parents, but they don't feel like they can really go home and live comfortably there anymore. And then the other big thing that happened during my years following the students is the 2016 presidential election happened. And so, where kind of before they were sort of quiet about their ruralness on their campus, post-election, they felt like they couldn't talk about being rural because there's a very particular narrative about rural communities that was dominating the national media. Rural communities are backwards, they're uneducated, they're responsible for electing Trump. And they felt like they were really, they couldn't belong on campus because they were rural. And so most of them got very, very quiet about being rural, and they felt like that part of their identity couldn't really be, it wasn't welcome on campus.
That's interesting. Did they have any coping strategies that they found to be effective in supporting them through not only college, but beyond?
Yeah, so they got really good at, what we often call code switching. Mm-hmm. Like this idea of sort of there's a particular set of rules and kind of cultural rules, language, that kind of thing that's used in one setting versus another. And they knew how to kind of go back and forth between those. They got pretty independent and good at being able to say, this is what I want out of my college education. And I'm here for these reasons. And I don't really necessarily care as much what everyone else is doing and everyone else is thinking. And they remained really close to their families. And so, again, even though there was all these kind of cultural divides, and some families there might even be political divides, they still felt like their family was a major source of support and a place of, and their home was a place of refuge. And so, many of them really continue to go home quite often. In ways that I actually felt like were really healthy. I think sometimes college administrators can get a little bit worried when they see a student going home quite a bit. For these students, I actually think it was quite adaptive.
Mara, your work also focuses on community organization, especially around, obviously, education reform. Can you talk a little bit about the role of the community organizing and improving educational outcomes for their students? Yeah.
So, and I mean, actually, some of the school closure work is, I think, some of the best example of this, where we'd like to believe that all schools and all rural schools are super responsive to their communities. They are, open places. They are equitable, but many are not. And we all honestly have like equity work to do, right? And so communities like organizing to improve, to reform their schools or improve their openness and accessibility to help ensure that all students get services. I think that is probably the most important source or the most important motivator for school reform. And so often this can take the form of organizing to keep schools open. But I've also seen a lot of organizing around like school discipline policies, for example, that might make for this school to prison pipeline. Or organizing to ensure that I used to do some work in Mississippi, and there a lot of the organizing was around fair, more equitable funding for rural schools, for predominantly Black districts. There's all kinds of ways in which school funding formulas can, disadvantage places that are that don't have high property values. And many of those places are rural. And so community organizing has been this really important tool for fighting for fair funding formulas that distribute funds in a more just and equitable way. And then, like I said, in many of the communities I'm working with, it's community organizing that has really kept schools open by fighting to improve resources, to change policy leadership, to change policies, to change leadership, to better fund schools. And so, I think, it's communities, like families are the experts in their children, right? Mm-hmm. And so I really think that, when communities are organized and organizing in ways that are fighting for greater equity for their children, for all children, like I think that's probably the most important source of like really moving the needle when it comes to education justice work. You couldn't pay me enough to be a school superintendent, and I know that it can be a scary prospect when you have an organized group of parents fighting for something. But like I said, we all have equity work to do. And it's the families that feel the injustices first. They notice them first. They see, and so it really takes a strong leader who can welcome that kind of organized community and say, okay, what's the work we can do here together to move our district forward for all of us. And so, and a large part of the organizing work, I think sometimes people have this stereotype in their head is all about angry parents that are trying to, shut things down or, do whatever. And, a lot of the organizing work is about building relationships. And so I really think that school, it's really incumbent upon school leaders to think about how can I partner with parents and, you want your parents engaged and these parents are engaged, so how do you leverage that in a way that really makes for, boosting educational quality, expanding educational access for everybody.
What policies or practices would you recommend to address some of those inequities that you're talking about and really improve educational outcomes for especially those marginalized students, all students, but especially those that are marginalized in rural settings?
Oh, wow. I think there's like, I didn't even know where to begin. I think that probably the biggest one is around funding. And we know that rural communities and especially rural low-income communities and rural Black, Indigenous, Latino communities are, they're the ones most impacted by funding inequities, right? And so I think anything we can do to fund our schools more equitably is really critical. And you look at, the places that have the hardest time hiring teachers, retaining teachers, upkeeping their buildings. It's, rural communities and particularly low-income rural communities and BIPOC rural communities. And that's a funding issue. And some of the districts I've worked with in Arkansas, they are taxing themselves at like the highest rate they possibly can. So they're feeling that burden, but they just can't get anything from it because the property values are so low. And so, I think we need to be thinking about really creative ways to make funding more equitable. And I used to work with an organization called Southern Echo in Mississippi, and they would talk about justice funding. And so this is funding that recognizes not just the current injustices, but the historic injustices that have led to today's current injustices. So this would mean disproportionately funding schools, but in favor of those places that have faced those historic wrongs, like enslavement, right? And so, I got to be really careful here. We don't want to confuse equality and equity. And we're not at equality. But what we really need is not just equality, but equity, and thinking about how do we make up for past wrongs? How do we make up for historic wrongs? So I think that's probably one of the biggest areas. And then I think, another big area is really anything that schools can be doing to build that school community connection. And, policies that promote schools as a gathering place, as a place where parents come in, feel comfortable, feel welcome. Looking at your language policies, are notices home going? Are they going in languages that everyone can read? Rural communities, they struggle when demographics change quickly in their rural community, and so it means how do we hire the EL teachers we need quickly? How do we change our policies, what's worked with a predominantly English audience, now that we've got a school community that's more language diverse? How do we make sure that our policies reflect that? So, I think anything that we can do on this front of making schools more open and, equitable and accessible to community members, I think is really important. One of the districts I worked with in Arkansas was called D-Light, and they've since been consolidated. But I worked with a principal there for a number of years, and she just had basically families could just use the building whenever they needed it. And so funerals would be held there. Reunions would be held there, like family reunions, things that had nothing to do with the school. And, her logic was just that if I've got the community in the school, they're going to feel comfortable. They're going to feel like this is a place where they're welcome. And then when something goes wrong, then they're going to feel comfortable coming to talk with me about it. And of course, it doesn't work perfectly. Of course, it's challenging. But she prioritized that level of engagement over some of the, the bureaucracy, we got to keep our schools, locked up. And, and I know those are major concerns. I don't want to discount that. But she was thinking about safety and thinking about openness in a much more holistic way than I've seen many principals think about it. And I think that was really to her advantage and to the advantage of the kind of education they could provide in that rural community.
And that, to your point, that in your book, Why Rural Schools Matter, you discuss how schools shape their communities. And that's an excellent example of how they do that. Are there other impactful ways that you've seen schools contribute to that community identity and that cohesion?
I think really thinking about the school community, not just in terms of the children and the parents, but in terms of everyone who lives in that local area. And so making sure you've got the programs that, the little old ladies knitting club, and, the workshop on how to tie flies, for fishing. So the things that will really get anyone into the school for any kind of reason, then when the times get tough or things get hard, you got to have that hard conversation. They're already there. They're already engaged. There's already that trust. So, I think anything you can do to make the school open, to build that kind of trusting relationship, and then to do the things like, we talked a little bit before about one of the biggest impacts when a school closes can be on the local businesses. And the places that I've seen that have the strongest school community relationship are those places that actually invest locally. So they made sure that the buses were serviced at a local service station. When it came time to paint the school, they didn't hire the contractor, from 2 hours away. They found that local contractor who could carry it out and who could do it. Because what I've found that happens, this is specific to school closure, but what I've found that happens before a school closes is there tends to be rifts within the community. There tend to be divides. People tend to distrust kind of brews. And so if you've really got that strong community school relationship, then if you become threatened by closure, you've got a community that's much more likely to turn out to fight to keep that school because it is so embedded in the community. It is such an important resource. So, there's all kinds of advantages that come with having that strong community school relationship. And one of the biggest ones is if you're in a place where you're threatened by closure, you've got a community that's prepared to do something.
So, Mara, one of the questions that I ask all of my guests is, what does the term rural advantage mean to you?
I feel like there's so many things I could say here. Like, there's so many advantages that come to mind. But I think the biggest one is that school-community relationship. And again, not every, just because you're a rural community or a rural school doesn't mean you have that relationship. So I'm talking about places where it's been cultivated, and there's that history of trust, and you've got dedicated teachers, and you've got the community that's willing to turn out. But if you have that, and just pays such dividends. I mean, economically, socially, politically, and then, most important, educationally. When there's a strong school community relationship, and when, families feel included, test scores go up, and kids are more likely to, trust that their teacher, they're more willing to take risks in the classroom, and be curious and feel like they're accepted for who they are. And so I think sometimes advocates of policies like consolidation can say, we're doing what's in the best interest of the kids, because they're going to be going to this bigger facility that has all these, additional, opportunities and things like that. And what they fail to recognize, though, is oftentimes, so then they say we need to do what's in the best interest of students, not what's in the best interest of the community. What they fail to realize, though, is what's in the best interest of the students often is what's in the best interest of the community. Those two things can be so linked that, when I think of rural advantage, I think of the potential for that really close, responsive, trusting relationship that just has benefits in all kinds of directions.
So what's next? What are you looking forward to in your research?
So like I said, my book on rural first generation students should be coming out next spring. It's called Educated Out. So I look forward to that coming out, and I look forward to the conversations that might come from that. And particularly conversations around how do we make it so that college is not just a pathway out. That's the reason I'm writing that book is because I don't think that colleges necessarily have to educate out. And so I'm really interested in what's the work around making sure that for students that want to, they can return to their home or to another rural community. And the other thing I'm looking forward to is, like I said, I'm doing some work around closure right now. I was really excited to create this website. And I'm really interested in okay, how can we kind of push the needle when it comes to this sort of unrecognized trend towards closure? How do we change that? And again, I'm particularly interested in those closures that are forced, that are discriminatory in some way. How do we stop that? And so I'm looking forward to thinking about how do we change that? And I think that we've got some tools now. I think there's more people that this is on their radar. So I think we're maybe in a place of possibility.
Well, thank you for spending some time with me today and going over a bunch of your research. I really appreciate your insights and the depth of your knowledge, and I know that it's going to benefit the field.
No, thank you. I'm really glad that I appreciate you bringing attention to this issue, and I appreciate the work of all your listeners. The work on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to The Rural Scoop. Please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe, or even leave us a comment. And be sure to follow on Twitter at Dr. Sadorf. That's Dr_SADORF, so that you never miss a new release. You can also check out previous episodes of The Scoop wherever you get your podcasts. Production support for The Rural Scoop is provided by Chattanooga Podcast Studios. Find out more at ChattanoogaPodcastStudios.com. See you next time for more great discussions about rural education.